Hard to know how to begin when introducing Maryam Namazie. She's worked tirelessly defending human rights in Turkey, Ethiopia, Sudan, Iran, and spoken at assemblies as far afield as India, Europe, the UK, Canada, and the USA. And she's been an active critic of any attempt to introduce and empower Sharia law in the West. Maryam is linked to many organisations, but she's best known as the spokesperson for the Council of Ex-Muslims of Britain and as a patron of the Association of Black Humanists, as well as an honorary associate of the National Secular Society. Maryam is severely critical of Islamic fundamentalism and considers it a great danger to the values held by Western society. Nevertheless, she has made it very clear that she is not anti-Islam, only Islamic extremism, and she similarly rejects the opposite extremism of far-right groups in the UK and elsewhere. So I'd like to say welcome, Maryam, and thank you for agreeing to be interviewed by Humanistically Speaking. It's a great pleasure and a privilege to meet you. Hi.
Hi, great. Thank you so much for having me.
Now, you were born in Tehran, but your family left Persia in 1980, which is just months after the Peacock throne was replaced by the Ayatollah. I remember that well. And Persia, that was renamed Iran, was plunged into what looked to me like an Islamic dictatorship. Now, you would have been about 14 at that time, and I guess you can probably remember the old Persia. So that process of transformation must have stood in relief. Can you share with us some of your recollections of that time?
Sure. I mean, one of the things that's important for me to say is that the Shah's government, the monarchy that was replaced by an Islamic regime, was also a dictatorship. I think sometimes looking back, people look more favorably upon that dictatorship, given how horrendous a theocracy is. But there was a reason why there was a revolution against the Shah, and the revolution was in fact not an Islamic revolution, and it was for an end to dictatorship, for freedom, for the qualities that people didn't have. And so unfortunately, though, it was basically taken over or expropriated by the Islamic movement, and we see the results of that today. So it was, a time of great change. It was sometimes very positive. When you are in a situation where people are trying to change the situation for the better, it's a great period of hope. And I think people feel that whether they're in Tahrir Square in Egypt or in the 99% movement in front of Wall Street in New York City. Do you know what I mean? That feeling of, there might be a possibility of change, the hope for change. But in many cases, that never comes to fruition because of the powers that people are faced up with. And so it did turn into a nightmare, really, a night terror, basically. People's hopes were completely destroyed, and it turned into a theocracy. And for me, I mean, my first recollections of this was in school, because going to school and not being veiled at the time because it was not yet the law, and being spat at basically for not wearing the veil, having people abuse us in our buses, in our school buses, because we weren't wearing what we were meant to wear. And also very clearly at school, because it was a mixed school, having Islamists come to the school to try to separate the boys from the girls. And it was quite a farce, because we kept going into the boys section, they kept coming into ours, and these Islamists were running after us, trying to keep us apart. And it's those sort of things that, I think about when I think about how quickly suddenly things started changing, and, the status quo changed completely to some extent.
So you saw this, that's really interesting. You saw this as a kind of precursor to the Arab Spring that came later, people just wanting their rights and their freedoms.
Yeah.
But I mean, there must have been a very significant minority of Islamists actually in Iran. You can't do something like that without a very large fraction of the population that share that view. Were you aware of that when you were 14?
Yeah, I mean, I think the reality is that the religious right has a base in every country, including in the United States, in Britain. We're seeing the rise of that religious right in Europe. We're seeing it in India. We're seeing it in Sri Lanka with the Buddhist right. So there is that trend in every society. And I think one of the things was it wasn't as obvious to us then. And one of the reasons because of it wasn't is that it wasn't as center stage as it is today. If you look at photographs of Iran, of Afghanistan, of Iraq from 40, 50 years ago, it looks completely different than it is today. And I think that is what happens when the religious right take power. They start slowly. They often come for women's rights first. They attack the most vulnerable in society first. And it is a blueprint for what is coming eventually. And I think from that perspective, it wasn't as clear, but also we have to remember the context at that time. It was during the Cold War. The US government's foreign policy, a big part of it was to create an Islamic belt against communism at the time. So if you remember, and you and I will remember this, there was a lot of support, military, financial, to Islamist groups like, if you remember, the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, in the fight against communism in the Soviet Union at the time. Yeah. So it was very much within that Cold War context that Islamism was brought to center stage. And even when we look at Iran, Western powers met in Guadeloupe. It's famously known as the Guadeloupe Conference. Unfortunately, most people don't recall this information because of historical amnesia and because victors always write history. But there was a conference where Western powers decided that they would prefer an Islamic state in Iran versus a left-leaning revolution that could have negative repercussions for Western government foreign policy. And so we see how that policy brought to center stage a movement that was on the periphery. And of course, that's not the case today. Today, it is one of the major powers in the world that we're faced with. But there are reasons for why it came to center stage that we often don't remember.
Sometimes I think colonial interference has caused far, far more trouble than it's worth, and that sounds like a bit of colonial interference. When was that? Just briefly, when was that conference?
This was on this conference and these events were on the eve of the establishment of an Islamic regime in Iran. So the Islamic regime got the go-ahead. There was a go-ahead, basically, that the Shah had to leave the country, and Khomeini was allowed to return to Iran from France. He was taken, he was in Iraq initially, and then he went to France where he had access to all the media of the world, and so that his voice could be heard. So all of these happened close to, the revolutionary period, and then what came to be the establishment of an Islamic Republic in Iran. And again, also, if you look at how this government came to power, yes, people came out in the streets to support the Khomeini upon his return. Yes, people celebrated the Shah leaving the country. Yes, there was a section of the left that thought that Islamism is a force of resistance, as many people on the left think today as well. They also see Islamism as a positive revolutionary force, whereas in fact it is a counter-revolutionary and a regressive force, a really inhuman force. But nonetheless, within there was that. But what I want to say is that, and obviously there is a trend, as you say, in any society that allows for these movements to take force. There is a trend in the UK for sure of this sort of far-right, xenophobic, anti-immigrant perspective that allows for Brexit, that allows for the EDL, but that's not all of society, what I want to say. And also, those forces would have less of an impact if they weren't given access to mainstream media and if they were not appeased and promoted even by the ruling elite. Do you know what I mean? So
yes, I do. And you actually brought it in nicely to the UK situation. I mean, you've repeatedly criticised the British government policy for indulging, if that's the right word, in giving special allowance for Sharia law in the UK when it comes to marriage, divorce, inheritance, and custody of children. And you've launched the One Law for All campaign. I just wonder, would you like to expand on your objections to this, please?
yeah, I mean, I think you know, it isn't extraordinary to say that religious laws are discriminatory against women at the very least. You know, that's a nice way of saying it. You know,
And it's not peculiar to Islam either, is it?
No, it isn't. I mean, I think all religious laws are discriminatory against women, and that's why historically we see feminist movements often coming face to face in their challenge of religious rules. You have the suffragists in Britain, for example, and in the US, who said that one of the greatest obstacles to women's emancipation is the church, is the Bible. Because of that reality. So I think, you know, within that context, it's very clear that Islamic laws are also extremely discriminatory and they promote violence against women. And I think one of the issues with Sharia courts here in Britain is that very often they're excused because they deal with matters of marriage, divorce, child custody, and it's not, you know, the decapitations or the amputations of hands of thieves. So people think that it's all right, you know, it's just dealing with family matters. But some of the greatest violations of women's rights take place within family laws, you know, and the family matters. The whether it comes to women being seen to be half of that of a man, women not having right to divorce or child custody, where marital rape is seen to be the prerogative of the husband, where again, domestic violence is seen to be the prerogative of the husband. So in these areas, this is exactly where women's rights are violated and where there are huge battles in countries where there is some form of Islamic law in the family against these laws, for civil laws. And so this fight for one law for all here is within that tradition of feminism and opposing religious rules in women's lives.
Well, you'll find quite a lot of references to that in the next issue of Humanistically Speaking, I'm happy to say, particularly in connection with the suffragettes. But I have to say that what worries me about Islam, or any faith for that matter, is the potential for the establishment of faith ghettos. Because ghettos lead to isolation, social isolation, and social isolation can lead to alienation, antipathy, and sometimes extremism. And to my mind, it's all underwritten by faith schools. And I imagine you've got views about that too.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of things here, sorry, that I want to make sure I don't forget. But one of the things is that with regards Islam, of course, you know, the danger is that it has links with the law and with the state. And so it's obviously, you know, more dangerous in the sense that if you have a theocracy where religious laws are part of the law of the land and Sharia courts are legislating those laws, it's obviously more dangerous than a situation where you've got religion that is also discriminatory against women, but it doesn't have a say in the law or the state or social.
Religion and power are a toxic mix. They always are, aren't they?
Exactly. So I think that that's one issue that we need to remember. The other is that, you know, there have been so many movements that One Law for All has been part of, along with Southall Black Sisters, to bring an end to Sharia courts. And we found that the government isn't interested in doing that. And I think part of the reason is because we do live in a society that is not secular in the real sense of the word. And there is an established church. And I think government policy has been such that it has wanted to ensure that religion's role continues, and therefore, you see faith schools continuing. There's this argument of equality. So there are Church of England schools, so there needs to be Islamic ones, and if Sharia courts are challenged, that will challenge the Brittain, the Jewish arbitration courts, and it will be a challenge to religious rules. And that's why the government has spent more time appeasing these arbitration bodies that are violating women's rights, whether it's the Jewish Brittain or the Sharia courts, as well as faith schools, because it sees it as making sure that religion continues to have its place in society. And of course, faith schools are hugely detrimental to children's rights, in the sense
child
that
abuse. It's child abuse. I think it's child abuse. Teaching children that are maybe 5 years old that they are of a particular religion and faith, and that's it. It's just closing their mind to other freedoms that they should
definitely, have. Definitely. I mean, there's when you use the term faith and education in the same sentence, there is a contradiction there, because faith is about believing in something irrespective of the evidence and facts, and education is to help you to doubt and question and think critically. And so there's an obvious contradiction to have faith involved with education. But I think it's important to recognize the British government's role in perpetuating the Sharia courts and the faith schools, and not just the Tories, but also the Labour Party, and how they have both done that in different ways, and to the detriment of citizenship and universal rights and women's rights, children's rights.
I think it was Tony Blair that accelerated the idea of faith schools throughout the country, and it was pretty shocking. Yeah. I'd like to draw
just one last thing about the issue of ghettoization. I think very often when we have this discussion, migrants are blamed for their ghettoization. They don't want to adapt. They want to stay in their slums and ghettos. And the reality is that multiculturalism, not as a wonderful lived experience of different people coming together in a society, but as a social policy, has brought about that ghettoization by dividing minority communities and leaving minority communities at the mercy of so-called community leaders, because it helps to manage those communities on the cheap and leave them at the mercy of those community leaders without treating them as equal citizens before the law. So I think, again, here, the responsibility of the state is key in the situation that we're faced with.
Yes, it's a good point. I've not thought of that before. Certainly the British have a record of ghettoization, even when the British were in charge. I mean, we've been pretty bad at that. So, but yes, it's a political expedient, and I think what we want is integration, not separation. Now, I'd like to draw attention to your council's latest video, in which 6 ex-Muslim women described their experience of leaving Islam. And I must say that, frankly, I found it hard to watch in parts, and I also found it deeply moving. I admire so much those ladies who agreed to be interviewed, and I would urge any reader of Humanistically Speaking to click on the other link that will be on this page and watch it for yourselves. But Maryam, can I ask you, why did you just have women in the story? Surely there were men who had difficulties too.
For sure, the leaving of Islam, and particularly in a situation where it's punishable by death in 13 Muslim majority countries, it's taboo. There's also a lot of shunning and ostracization and threats and violence around leaving Islam, not just for people who live in Muslim majority countries, but also people who live in Britain and Europe. And clearly it's something that affects both men and women. But I think for women, it's a lot harder because of the controls, the social controls on women and the difficulties they have in being able to take that step and to renounce Islam and to do it publicly. I mean, this film was 3 years in the making because all the people we originally interviewed ended up mostly not being in the film because of worries and fears and concerns. And most of them didn't have their faces shown, and they were very worried about being identified because so many women still live double lives. Men do too, but more so women because of also the physical, you know, the fact that they need to be veiled. Their movement is much more controlled by family and the so-called larger community. And so the restrictions on women is a lot more, and the hate that they face also is a lot worse. It always involves sexual threats to sexual violence. And so, you know, we wanted to sort of highlight the difficulties for women, the specific difficulties for women. And also, you know, a lot of the work we do is sort of opening the way for others to do the same if they want to, you know. And I think that's one of the lessons of the Council of Ex-Muslims of Britain. When we established in 2007, there were people who said that there aren't any ex-Muslims. What are we doing this for other than to, you know, as an act of attention seeking, you know? And now what we see very clearly is that there is a tsunami of ex-Muslims, basically. And there are many, many ex-Muslims out there. Social media has helped to show that as well. And so it's part of the process of helping women to see that they're not alone, that they can do it, and that no matter what the risks, you know, being able to live the way you want is such a huge achievement in someone's life.
I must say, I'm absolutely overwhelmed with admiration for them. I think they're brave women, courageous women, and I hope they have influence with other women and other people who are labelled as Muslims who don't see themselves in that way. Are you in touch with the Faithless organisation that's under the Humanist UK umbrella? I mean, do you work alongside them? I can obviously see a common interest there.
Yeah, I mean, yes. I mean, the thing with our organisation and other ex-Muslim organizations, we have now an international coalition of ex-Muslim groups, is that our focus is on Islam and on those leaving Islam, because whilst there are commonalities between people who leave other religions, you know, there is a special case to be made for ex-Muslims, and there is a need to focus on the right to be an ex-Muslim without having to apologize for it, and also the right to criticize Islam, even mock it, you know, as well as the religious right movement of Islamism, without having to sort of say, you know, we're all in this together. Well, the reality is we're not. Some face much harsher punishments, and some take much greater risks. And there is a need to recognize that and to focus on it without apology.
Yes, you're right. The Faithless organisation doesn't just cover Islam, it covers the other religions too. Now, thank you very much for that. I'd like to move on now to the famous nude protests in which you and 11 other women, ex-Muslims all, had naked photos taken and then pasted into a monthly calendar. I presume inspired by calendar girls, I don't know. Well, I know you regard the burqa as a symbol of Islamic oppression. It's certainly how it comes over to me as well. But I imagine those who wear burqas are not normally naked underneath. So what was your intention here? How did it come to pass?
Well, this particular nude protest came to pass because of an Egyptian atheist woman, Alia Majd al-Mahdi, who posted a nude photo of herself while she was in Egypt as a scream against misogyny. And because of her action, she was threatened. She was actually kidnapped. She faced great risks. She's now living in Sweden. She managed to get protection and asylum in Sweden. But it was an act to defend her because, you know, when it comes to nudity of women, there's no problem with nudity and pornography, in the commodification of women's bodies in order to sell cars and to sell beer. But there's a huge problem with women's bodies when it's in their own hands as a tool for liberation and protest. And so this action of nudity as protest, as a tool to subvert, the status quo and its view of women's bodies, was why that nude calendar took place. It was a support of Alia Majd al-Mahdi, and it was also, a challenge to the Islamist movement, because they are so insistent that women are covered and erased from the public space. And I think that's why it makes nudity as political protest so key. But that's one of the many things that we've done with the Council of Ex-Muslims of Britain over the years, because there is something to be said about using creativity, humor, as a way of challenging, forces that are so dark and desperate, and that terrorize and threaten as part of their daily activities, So for example, we've marched topless in Gay Pride for a number of years, with placards that said Allah is gay, for example. Again, the police came and tried to remove our placards. And we argued that if you can say Jesus is gay or Jesus has two dads, you should be able to say Allah is gay. You're only offended if you think being gay is wrong or is a perversity, as some people will think. Otherwise, there's absolutely nothing wrong with saying Allah is gay. So those are the sorts of things we've done, including, for example, eating during Ramadan. We've had picnics in front of embassies that persecute people for eating during Ramadan as an act of solidarity with those who are imprisoned or flogged for eating and drinking during that month. So different actions that are basically creative ways of challenging the Islamists, poking fun at them, because truly, if you can laugh at them, if you can go in the public space topless with an Allah is gay placard, if you can carry out nude protests, it's a way of breaking away at their power and their hegemony on people's lives.
Well, laughing at something like that is the thing that probably they're most afraid of. Mockery and that kind of contempt. So I understand now why you did that. It's just mocking the whole thing, which is extremely brave of you and the other ladies. I mean, there must have been some serious fallback on that. There must have been some fallout that you must have been on the receiving end of. I mean, have you ever been afraid for your own life? Have you ever been threatened yourself?
I mean, there's always fallout, of course. I mean, I think one of our protests, we had a topless protest in the Louvre, in front of the Louvre in Paris.
I remember it. Yes, I remember it.
2014, I think, we were arrested by French police, and there was a riot in a country because of our protest. I think it was in Pakistan. I can't quite remember, but what I want to say, there is always fallout, and as there is with any political movement, whether it's Black Lives Matters, whether it's the suffragette movement, whether it's the civil rights movement, gay rights movement, there's always fallout. There are people who disagree vehemently and might even want to kill as a result. And there are those who will fight and open up the space and change the status quo for the better. And I think, this is one of those fights where it can be risky, of course, but there is also huge amounts of support and huge amounts of solidarity. And I think they sort of, for me, that it cancels out the threats and the intimidations that might follow.
Do you not consider yourself brave? I do.
I'm not sure. I mean, for me, it's a matter of life and death. So it's something that has to be done. So, I mean, I think people who do it in countries like Iran, like Afghanistan, like Iraq, are really brave. And those of us who fled those societies, well, we have a responsibility to, continue that
Solidarity.
movement in other ways and make sure that they get the support that they want.
Thank you for that. It's important to say, and I know you'll agree with this, Maryam, that the overwhelming majority of Muslims are not only peaceful, tolerant and kind, but also bring enormous benefits to British society. But why do you think it seems to be particularly Islam that inspires such violence?
I think that, as you said, I think that people are people, and there is no good, a good society or bad society, a good group of people or a bad group of people. The reality is that groups are made up of individuals, and they must be held accountable for their actions, both good and bad, praised for good actions, and if something bad happens, well, that needs to be addressed as well. But this idea that things are linked to migration or to Muslims, I think, is a false sort of it's a false way of looking at the issues, because for example, if you look at the issue of sexual violence, some like Ayaan Hirsi Ali will say that there's a rise in sexual violence in Europe because of a rise of men from Muslim majority countries. And again, there's no truth to that, because the reality is that the common denominator is not that they come from Muslim majority countries, but the common denominator is just men that commit sexual violence. Do you know what I mean? So I think if we don't look at the problem, if we want to scapegoat people and place collective blame, which is really, remnants of tribalism, rather than holding people as individuals accountable if they commit crimes, I think we aren't able to reach a solution. I do think there's a problem, of course, with Islam, as all religions, but particularly with Islam, only because of its links to political power. So, there was a problem with Christianity during the Inquisition. There is still a problem with Christianity in countries, in some African countries, where, children are exorcised and have, pieces of their bodies cut and chopped off as a way of dealing with witchcraft, and supposed witchcraft, because the child is seen to be disobedient, for example. What I want to say is that depending on the power of a religion, that is the degree in which people's lives will be adversely affected. And with Islam, the issue is that there are many states now that have Islam as not only a state religion, but Islamic law as the actual law. But we can see even today the effects of religious rules on the lives of people. If you look at the United States and the rise of the Christian right there, they are fighting now for the right to abortion, which was taken as a guarantee. In Poland, we're seeing the attack on women's reproductive rights, on gay rights. We see it in India with the rise of the Hindu right and Modi's government. Muslims are being killed for eating beef, and Buddhists, you hear about how wonderful and kind Buddhism is, but the Buddhist right in Sri Lanka and Myanmar are attacking Muslims left, right, and center. And so I think it's that link to power that's important. Religion that has power, religious right movements that have access to power are detrimental to people's rights. And that's why, if we look at it that way, the solution is a political response to a political movement, rather than scapegoating minorities and Muslims and immigrants.
It goes back to the comment I made earlier that religion, any religion, and power are a very toxic mix. And you're absolutely right to say that there's nothing special about Christianity. I think Christianity has been dragged into a more gentle approach to its faith. But when Christianity was extremely powerful, people were burned, tortured for just being different. And the tribal issue that worries me is that I think we're all potentially tribal. I think we're all potentially racist. And I think the important thing to bear in mind is to be aware of that and to be guarded against it, because there's nothing special about those particular people that are racist. It's in us all, and we need to be on our guard. That's how I feel anyway. So thank you so much for that. So how best do you think the West can protect itself from Islamic extremism? I mean, can you name any non-Islamic countries that are more successful at that than any others?
I mean, I think that the idea again of the West protecting of itself is the wrong question, maybe from my perspective, because I know that there is this idea, and this is something that people like Douglas Murray and Ayaan Hirsi Ali promote, this idea of a clash of civilizations, and this the idea that the West needs to protect itself, or how can it, fits within that idea that there are, the West versus, the other sort of thing. And for me, I think it is a clash between secularists everywhere versus theocrats everywhere. And I think if we look at it that way, we can then begin to see the many friends we have that are also religious believers that live in Iran and Afghanistan and Iraq and Saudi Arabia, and also begin to see people who live in the West and Western governments also, where they truly fit. I mean, if we're talking about Islamism as a far-right religious movement, then it brings to question the fact that Saudi Arabia is one of the closest allies of Western governments. It brings into question the sort of political, economic relations with the Iranian regime, with the Pakistani regime, and so on and so forth. So I think, it is important that we look at it as a sort of global struggle. I think it's easy to see that that's the case. If you look at the white nationalists and the white supremacists, you can see that they are making links from the US to Europe, to Australia. When Breivik goes and kills young people in Norway, he mentions far-right groups in other countries, not just Norway. And the Islamists have those links as well. And I think what we need to do as secularists is to begin to make more of those links and see beyond the sort of limits that governments and the Islamists seem to impose, and to break beyond those limits and to see our sort of commonalities with so many secularists fighting for the separation of religion from the state at great risk to their lives. So I think, that's very key, as is this sort of going back to concepts of universal rights. Very often we hear that these are Western concepts again. And I always find it interesting how the Iranian regime will never say we don't want nuclear technology because it's a Western concept, because the first country that used, the H-bomb was the United States. There's never that argument when it comes to bombs and machinery and weapons of destruction. That somehow seems to be universal. But when it comes to rights, then suddenly, it becomes Western if women want the right to choose what to wear, if women don't want to be treated as second-class citizens. And I think, again, any human right is a victory of people's movements and social movements and political movements that are truly, in fact, universal because they belong to everyone. So I think those are really key in us being able to address the Islamist right, but also other religious right movements, if we view it politically and think of ways to challenge it politically.
So it's not a national issue or even an international issue, it's a worldwide issue. And in fact, what you seem to be saying is that in order to win this war, if you like, it has to be approached on a worldwide stage, not limited to what the UK does or what America does or even what Europe does. It's a worldwide issue.
Yeah, it is. It's like COVID. It's like the COVID pandemic. You
Yeah.
can't just vaccinate everyone in Britain. It is a global problem, and we have to make sure that we vaccinate everyone. And I think it's the same with the religious right. Even if you stop all migration, there are so many homegrown terrorists that will continue the work because it is a political movement, and it needs to be addressed politically as well as ideologically, whilst defending citizenship rights and universal rights. I think, you know, it's fighting on different fronts at the same time.
Okay, well, my last question, actually, you touched on it just a moment ago, is about um, how we should deal with extreme fundamentalist societies. I mean, Saudi Arabia, for example. Um, it seems to me that, and this is only my personal view, that we deal with Saudi Arabia because Saudi Arabia is such an enormous economic power that we feel the need to deal with. So we put our moral niceties to one side. We accept some things that perhaps we wouldn't accept from other countries. But what do you think would be the best approach for this country or for secularists to deal with Saudi Arabia and countries like that in order to effect change in those countries? That's a tough one, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I think, look, we live in a system everywhere where profit is more important than human rights and welfare. We know that, whether you live in Somalia, whether you live in Britain or Iran, it's the same. And unfortunately, that is what the world is based on. You know, it's not based on human rights. It's based on the sort of profit first, profit second, profit last, basically. Human rights never seems to come into it. And I think, you know, we do have a responsibility to change that, however difficult it may seem, and to put human rights first. And I think to do that, you know, there has to be enough pressure for governments to change the way that they do business. And I think, you know, I'm of that age, and I think you are as well, where we, you know, I was involved in the anti-apartheid movement. It was the first movement that really politicized me, apart from, you know, the situation in Iran and having fled an Islamic state. And, you know, it was very clear how there was a time when Nelson Mandela was called a terrorist by Margaret Thatcher, where there were all sorts of investments in South Africa, and profit was first. And then there was such, you know, anger and opposition to the continuation of racial apartheid. It became considered such an abomination on human history that governments started pulling out their investments, that they stopped supporting apartheid. And, you know, there was that change. Racial apartheid had ended. And, you know, there is an argument to be made that in a place like Iran, in a place like Saudi Arabia, there is a system of sexual apartheid. And because you are a woman, you are segregated, you are considered less, you have separate entrances for women in government offices. You know, there are curtains that divide women and men from mountaintops to the sea, you know. And what that means as well is that you don't have access to certain jobs. For example, you can't be a judge in Iran because women are considered too emotional to be judges. You can't run for office in Iran. You can't be a woman and become the president. You know, certain fields of study are closed to women. You know, and if you're not veiled, if you're not covered up, you are seen to be the source of fitna or chaos in society. And government officials blame everything from the drying of lakes to earthquakes to, you know, the fact that women were not properly veiled, even though it's compulsory in Iran. So there is an argument to be made that this is such an abomination that we must take serious action and put, this issue before and above profit. And I think there are problems why this is not the case, why our situation today is different from the anti-apartheid movement of South Africa. One is because there is a section of the left, and I say that as someone firmly on the left myself, that thinks that Islamism is a revolutionary force, whereas it's not, and that criticism of Islam or Islamism is a form of bigotry and racism, which it's not. And also we live at a time when there's identity politics, and you're not allowed to say anything unless you are an authentic member of that identity, not even anyone in that identity. You have to be authentic, and to be authentic, the more regressive and backward you are, it seems the better of a representative you are. And so because of all of these problems, it's not as easy to organize, but we have to do it. And I think we have a responsibility to do it.
Yeah,
and hopefully we'll see change as a result.
Yeah, I think there's reason for hope, actually, and reason for optimism, because I know you'll think this is not really connected, but I'm thinking of climate change, which is actually shaking the world up. It's shaking everything up, and it's making politicians come to terms, or forcing them to come to terms with the fact that maybe there are other things that are more important than profit. And I just have a feeling that over the next maybe 10, 15 years, this could be our chance when profit and wealth become secondary to some of the more important issues, starting with climate change and possibly ending with human rights, which I think is so important.
For sure. I mean, I think the reality is that a lot of the movements in the Middle East, North Africa, South Asia, and parts of Africa are very much women-led, and are breaking, the sexual apartheid in a way that would be considered Islamophobia if you did it here in Europe. But I think because of that, and the fact that social media allows people to connect with each other across borders and see the resistance that taking place, it becomes very clear that it's not, a Western or Eastern issue. It's a universal issue, and one that we all have a role to play. I'm not sure that governments will ever, under a capitalist system, accept that profit has to come second, but I think the point I'm making is that they can be forced to do things against their self-interest, because there is so much outrage about, as you mentioned, climate change, and there should be about something like sexual apartheid.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. So I'm hopeful. I think these are exciting. They're very difficult times with coronavirus and all the rest of it, but they're worldwide issues which are bringing people up, and I think they're exciting times. The potential for change has never been greater, and I'm optimistic about that. Maryam, I've so enjoyed this interview. It's just been fantastic. Is there anything that you would like to add, just to finish off, about something that maybe we haven't addressed that you might like to point out or comment on?
The only thing I would say too is that I'm optimistic as well. I mean, I think if you're an activist, you have to be optimistic. You have to see the potential for change. And I think that it's always easy to see the darkness and the despair, but there is so much resistance on the other side. And I think seeing that resistance brings courage and hope. And hopefully it just will snowball and bring about really fundamental changes.
Well, I'm delighted to hear you say that. And the point of Humanistically Speaking, it's a humanist magazine, but it's there for everyone to read. And we hope that people of all faiths and none would find it enjoyable, instructive and interesting. Maryam, all I can say is thank you again so much for coming online, and good luck with the cause, because I'm right behind you.
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you for giving me this chance.
Brilliant interview. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much.